The following is a pre-recorded broadcast brought to you live for the purpose of live discussion.
Thanks for joining me today on Stay Live Streams in my conversation with LaToya Johnson of the City of New Orleans and its consent decree. Let's get into the questions.
To those in our community who demanded change, thank you for speaking up.
To our community, thank you for your partnership as we move forward.
Well, we're going to be talking about the consent decree that was recently signed between Louisville Metro Government, the Louisville Metro Police Department, and the U.S. Department of Justice.
At the end of the day, the people of Louisville deserve constitutional and effective policing and nothing less.
LaToya, thank you so much for joining us today. So glad to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, very briefly, and the work that you do in New Orleans?
So, native New Orleanian, born and raised. I have been organizing in the city of New Orleans for the past, I'll say about 13, 14 years now. Started out labor organizing and then kind of moved into political and community organizing. And right now, that's where I am, political and community organizing and influencing policy within the state of Louisiana.
In your visits to Louisville, how have you seen issues playing out that have led up to our city being in a consent decree?
So again, I've been to Louisville a few times, and to be completely honest, only watched the news a handful of times. Most of the information that I've received about Louisville and the things that are happening on the ground in Louisville have come from the people on the ground in Louisville. And so it never fails. Every time I come to Louisville, it's always an issue with police, even after the Breonna Taylor murders, right? And these people still keep in touch, these organizers. And so, the Breonna Taylor murders, people monitoring police, there's been a lot of police murders, right? Issues with school buses, issue with the teachers. So it's interesting how things build up to a consent decree. And then people were so okay as long as they were quote unquote isolated incidents. But then when you kind of roll them all into one and ask for something like a consent decree, they're up in arms. And so that was very interesting to me. So again, I got all of my information from and all the things that I know about Louisville from those on the ground in Louisville.
So one of the things that I know from conversations with people and having been to New Orleans many times is that there's a common misconception that, and it goes back to your previous comment, that the consent decree in New Orleans grew solely out of what happened with Hurricane Katrina. But it didn't, as you just said. So can you expand on that a little bit more about how the Hurricane Katrina and the police's response during Katrina was not the only catalyst for a consent decree in New Orleans?
Right. And so I think that's what I was getting at. So one incident wasn't more important than the other. And I think what made all of the difference is the level of organizing that happened in the city of New Orleans, right? So after Katrina, you had a lot of organizing happening around the native New Orleanians, around housing, the injustice, and around police brutality, around immigration, right? And so the sheer number of people that stood up after all these things happened, people had to take notice and come down and do these investigations. So I think the history of injustice and it boiling over after Hurricane Katrina really moved things along, getting a consent decree in New Orleans.
And history is so important. It's vital. And people need to know their history. We talk about it. You hear people say it. Sometimes it sounds a little glib or flippant when people say you need to know your history in order to not repeat it. And to your point, right, you needed to know the history of policing in New Orleans to understand that it was a culmination of a lot. Like you said, no one incident is more important than the other. So I've got some additional questions to dig in more into the consent decree in New Orleans. So what did the independent monitor process look like in New Orleans? Because we are very concerned about that in Louisville. So was the independent monitor selected from within the city, or was it someone who was hired from outside of the city?
Want to be honest, I know for a fact that they were selected from someone within the city, but I don't know the process. I wasn't a part of the process of the independent police. Y'all may want to edit that part out because I have no idea. I don't know how we got here with that office. So I don't know the process. What I can say about the office is that I understand exactly what they're supposed to do. On paper, it's beautiful. Yes, we need the thing. In actuality, in practice, I'm not sure if that happens, right? And so I would say for the city of New Orleans, it's very important that we do choose someone from the city of New Orleans, right? And it was very important that that individual either came from community or did work within the community. I would hope for that for Louisville, right? That the person that you all choose would be from community or have worked with community, and someone familiar with those doing work on the ground and with the communities in Louisville. But to be honest, I'm not sure of the exact process that happened with the city of New Orleans in their monitor's office.
And that's important because when community and people like you who are active are unaware, it says a lot about the way the process is being led. And that's one of the concerns we have here in Louisville. Is it going to be transparent? Is it going to be a responsible process that respects community? So the fact that you aren't as aware as you could and should be says a lot about how the process works. So I appreciate your honesty and transparency there. With community involvement in mind, which you just referred to, LaToya, what are some tips, ideas, or advice that you would give to Louisvillians as we move forward to Federal Judge Benjamin Beaton signing our consent decree into order?
Tips for the community moving forward. Choosing my words. I think that we in New Orleans and in Louisville, we have a lot of community meetings where folks are given space, right, to voice their concerns, which is great. We need it. It's amazing. The concern comes in where folks leave those meetings and there are no next steps. My suggestion would be that whoever holds space for these meetings would be able to organize community members into actionable next steps, realistic next steps, right? And so we can dream big. We want to have this end goal, and that's fine. Realistically speaking, folks need to organize and create some actionable next steps. Realistic next steps.
And I'm hearing that the delay from on the mayor's side, which is in that building right there, is because they want to have a clear exit strategy, citing that other cities with consent decrees have been went on for a long time, with monitoring for a long time. And I say that, so what? So what? It's going to cost money, it's going to take time, and they have to pay for it. We're paying for it anyway. We're paying for it in the abuses. We're paying for it in the lawsuits. We're paying for it over and over again with our city budget as their budget continues to increase. We can afford this consent decree.
That can only be done in space with communities. So that doesn't look like we have one community meeting and then we move from that one community meeting. That looks like having a series of community meetings accessible to everybody in different parts of the community. Right, that may look like a survey, that may look like some door knocking, whatever. But you want people to be able to not only voice their concerns, but also voice how they can actually participate, right?
We call on residents to attend public meetings and hearings, join advisory committees, and comment on draft policies and training. And just as they have for decades, residents can and should push for changes beyond the consent decree process. Federal law is a floor, not a ceiling on what is possible.
And then also be a part of the creation of this strategy that Louisville needs. I would say, if we're talking about the independent police monitor and the things that aren't happening in New Orleans, I would say a committee or, just a group of folks would need to be created to monitor the monitor, right? To ensure that they're actually doing the things that they were put in place to do. And that also may require them doing some of the things that the monitor is put in place to do, right? So it would require a working relationship between this committee and the monitor's office. I would also suggest that there be a consistent series of workshops for community members to learn more about the consent decree, learn about the importance of the consent decree. Because what I've learned is if you rely on the news, you rely on your mayor's press release, you won't know anything.
Today, we'll be posting an RFP for those interested in serving as the independent monitor that will ensure we are meeting our benchmarks. This will be a public selection process. We'll vet those applicants with the Department of Justice, and the community will be able to meet the finalists before a final decision is made.
Right. And the way they present the information to the public, it makes it seem like it's not that big of a deal. And it absolutely is. So if there is a continuous stream of information to community members about the consent decree and what's in it, that would be great. And also what I've learned is that as organizers, we have to be interpreters for this language. If we give them a bunch of jargon, they're not going to understand, because I damn sure barely understand it, right? We have to break it down, make it edible for community members so they can understand, hey, this is exactly what's going to happen. This is what it said. This is what this means. This is what's going to happen. And here's how we can organize against it, right? Or for it, shall I say. And at the top of my head, I think those are the top 3 or 4 things that I can think about for Louisville.
You just laid it out. Thank you so
I laid
much.
it out.
You did. And that last piece, though, about us being interpreters is so real, because I remember serving in the state legislature, and my first session coming back home and saying to folks, y'all, these bills are intentionally written in language that most of us are not able to understand, right? If they're written in ways that use jargon or use $10 words when you can just use a dime word to mean the same thing. So I absolutely get it. You said something that I want to dig into a little bit more, though, LaToya. You mentioned monitoring the monitor. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means and what that could look like to monitor the monitor?
Yeah. And so monitor the monitor looks like a committee. And it will be up to community members and organizers to, one, decide who would be on that committee. And they should be allowed access to certain information that the police monitor's offices also have access to. And they should be able to hold the monitor's office accountable for the things that they're supposed to be doing. So let's say, for instance, there's a complaint against a police officer, right? And the monitor's office is supposed to step in, and they did not. It's up to that committee to hold the monitor's office under the fire, right? And say, hey, what about this? When it comes to data and collecting data, it's up to the committee to say, hey, every quarter, every month, however we want to have it, to ask the monitors, hey, do you have this information? Because you're supposed to be collecting it, right? Do you have these trainings for officers? Because that's supposed to happen and you're supposed to make sure, right? And so that would mean that the committee should 100% understand what the office is for, what the duties of the office are, and then hold them accountable at certain increments, every month, every quarter, or whatnot. And the committee should also be prepared not to do the job of the police monitor, but be prepared not just to hold them accountable, but to move things along if they slack. All right.
Thank you for that, because I want folks who are tuning in to know that this is different from the Office of Inspector General that we have here in Louisville. So we Office of Inspector General here, and that office is doing its work. It has the Civilian Police and Accountability Review Board. And then we're talking about the independent monitor who is coming in to monitor the consent decree. So those are the 2 different things. So I just want to make sure that people understand that. So thank you for breaking that down. So I understand that there is a hearing date approaching to decide whether to end the consent decree in New Orleans.
Mhm.
What led to this hearing, LaToya, and what are some of your thoughts toward the consent decree ending in New Orleans?
It's very interesting, which also can be a lesson for Louisville, right? Um, I've heard the mayor say that it's very expensive. We're spending millions on a consent decree. Um, and not much talk has been around finances and money when we talked about the consent decree in New Orleans. So it's very interesting now that that is a big part of the conversation. And I don't know if that is transparent for community members. Cannot easily access how much money we spent on the things that you say that we spent it on. I don't know if that's transparent. And so I would say, starting from the beginning in Louisville, you all would want to make sure that you have access to that information. Where is that money going and how much of it is being spent?
The consent decree handcuffs our officers by making their jobs harder, pestering them with punitive punishment, and burying them with paperwork.
While a federal judge will have to approve the end of the independent oversight, Cantrell and Chief Sean Ferguson said some changes will be in-house, including outfitting 75 new cars in the fleet, accelerating promotions, and figuring out ways to let civilians handle minor calls.
It's also very interesting that it was said that it's a crisis. Police officers are quitting. We're understaffed. Yeah, exactly. You should be, right? But it's also interesting. There's a parallel because on the one hand, they're saying crime hasn't gone up. Look at the numbers. The city is doing well. And then at the same time say, it's a crisis. There are no police officers, right? So if we're going to rely on data and information from the media, we can't double talk ourselves. And also, I heard them saying that, it's a problem that police officers have to seek certain permissions to do certain things. We're pestering police officers with the consent decree and all the things that we're holding them accountable to. It pesters them. It makes their jobs harder. It's too much paperwork, which if you think about, that's the exact reason why there's a consent decree. Yes, you have to do paperwork because when we asked you for documentation, you didn't have it. So do the paperwork. Yes, you need permissions because before when you didn't have permissions, you abused that power. And now we're pestering you with a consent decree that you didn't live up to begin with. So the ending of the consent decree is very interesting to me. Them pushing for it, shall I say. When they can say we spent a lot of money, they can say we pestered police. It's too much documentation, all the things. And also is what we need. So I don't know that we should be ending it. There's a hearing where, like you said, community members will come and voice their concerns about it. But the approach that local government has taken to the consent decree is very interesting because the reports that they give about the city, the improvements of the city is because of the consent decree. And now you want to end it because you say that it is harmful to the city. So they contradict themselves a bit. And so my suggestions for Louisville is make sure y'all track that money, understand where it's going and how much of it is being spent, and also be very transparent about what the consent decree is supposed to do and if that's actually happening. Because that's another thing that the monitor's office is also supposed to be doing. Community members are supposed to be getting updates about whether or not this consent decree is being adhered to. And so make that information available, widely available and transparent. And that way, when it comes time years later, when y'all's mayors say, hey, we need to end this, you all have documentation that says, no, we cannot, right?
Thank you, because it's important for us to think about what it will mean when the consent decree ends. Will we be going back to, will the police department revert to what it was before the consent decree was implemented if we, the people, haven't done our job of monitoring the monitor, as you said before?
Right.
So yeah, I really appreciate that. And you said something else that I think is really important, and that is that your mayor is pushing to end the consent decree. Well, here in Louisville, the mayor kept saying over and over again before finally filing the consent decree, we need to be clear about the exit strategy. Like that was a goal of his, was how do I get out of this?
Mhm.
And so that's something that we as Louisvillians have to pay close attention to. So thank you for that. I have one more question. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I wouldn't say that's a bad idea. You want an exit strategy, but it should come from community. It shouldn't be your exit strategy. So he should work with community members to develop an exit strategy, a termination strategy, right? But it can't look like we've done this thing, what we've agreed to, it's done, it's over. Now we're going back to our old ways. I think, again, organizers in Louisville, I'm going to say we, right? Because I'm there. So we have time to develop this strategy with community members and the mayor, right? To understand and to build what it would look like once the consent decree is over.
Well, LaToya, you just opened the door to the People's Consent Decree, because that was one of our purposes as the People's Consent Decree, was to be part of helping to craft the consent decree so that, to your point, we, the people, could be part of conversations like the exit strategy, the independent monitor, the Office of Inspector General, etc. But we, the
Mhm.
people, including our proxies, Louisville Metro Council representatives, were excluded from the consent
Mm.
decree process. So all we knew is that the mayor wanted to be clear about the exit strategy. We didn't know what that exit strategy would look like. So we were excluded from that. So thank you.
Mhm.
So I have one more question before we take a break and come back to digging in more into the consent decree in New Orleans. So in your opinion, what are some of the differences in the way that your police department operates since it has been under the consent decree? What differences have you noticed pre-consent decree and now that they're under a consent decree?
I honestly don't know if there are any noticeable changes. I think that we've been given data. We've been given data that says that there have been changes. I don't know that our community feels that, right? There's still complaints about injustice. There are still complaints about brutality. There's still complaints about the misuse and abuse of power. And so I think the noticeable difference here, or the notable difference, is that with the consent decree, now as organizers, we have something to refer back to and say, hey, you all are supposed to be doing this thing, right? And something to hold them accountable to. But as far as how it feels as a citizen in New Orleans, I don't know that it feels any differently, right?
Hmm. Interesting.
Mhm.
Something for us to keep in mind and for us to think about as we're monitoring this whole consent decree process is, what are our benchmarks as community for what change looks like, for what different policing looks like. So we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back to a set of questions that dig us a little bit deeper into the New Orleans consent decree.
Hey, I know you're watching the live stream right now, but I want to take a moment to tell you to check out this new book right here over my shoulder. Believe me, it'll be worth it.
The lights of Kentucky Performing Arts shine on more than our shows. They illuminate a pathway of discovery for all throughout our Commonwealth. A pathway of creativity, confidence, possibility, of brilliance, inspiration, curiosity, and wonder. For 40 years, Kentucky Performing Arts has led a pathway to unite the Commonwealth around the joy of discovering the arts, and will continue to shine this light far into the future.
Well, welcome back. And LaToya, thank you so much for the time that you're spending with us today. So I want to get into the next round of questions. So Mayor Greenberg here in Louisville talked about how we're not waiting for the consent decree to go into effect to start reforms. Is this something that took place in New Orleans? Change is happening in advance of the consent decree going into effect?
I would say it's something that was said what was going to happen. Um, in practice, I don't know that it actually did, right? And so it was said, there's going to be all this reform with the police. There are going to be trainings. There are going to be all the things. And in practice, I don't know that that happened.
Promotion, accountability. And it takes a while to message those things. And I think by the time we left, the consent decree was in effect for about 18 months, and we were making some headway. I think Chief Harrison made some headway, and I think Chief Ferguson made some headway. But what really destroys the NOPD's ability to be successful in the consent decree, and the judge made a point of this last time, is if you built a department to be 1,300 and you're only 900, what are you not doing that needs to be done to ensure the consent decree is being followed? That will likely continue to be a key issue.
And also, I feel like in both our cities, there's always been talk of change and reform in police that just doesn't happen. And with the consent decree, again, we have something to refer back to and to hold the police department accountable to, right? And so again, change happening prior to the execution of the consent decree. There's a lot of planning and talking. In actuality, it didn't happen until we had something to hold them accountable to. I'll say that.
And that makes sense, right? That you have to have something to hold government, to hold law enforcement. We hold ourselves accountable, right? Yeah, for our actions. So that makes sense that you needed to have that document to make that happen. So your Mayor Cantrell, 2 years ago, called for an end to your 10-year consent decree, stating that it handcuffed their officers, language that Mayor Greenberg here in Louisville has parroted. What has policing looked like since Mayor Cantrell's statement, and is New Orleans still under a consent decree?
New Orleans is still currently under a consent decree for now. And honestly, personally, I don't think policing looks differently. Using the word handicapped officers is interesting because, again, as I stated before, the reason why we needed a consent decree is because they weren't doing the things that we needed them to do. So if filling out some paperwork to document your actions is a handicap, I don't even know what to say to that. I don't know what to say to that. When we asked for documentation, which really is another form of accountability, you didn't have it. How is that a handicap, right? The cameras to hold officers accountable. How is that a handicap? That can't be a handicap. We're making officers' jobs difficult because they need permissions to do certain things before they do them, which also prevents the abuse of power. How is that a handicap? And so, honestly, I don't see a change in policing. I just don't understand how it's a handicap and it's an inconvenience for police when all of the things in the consent decree protect the citizens of New Orleans and Louisville. That cannot be a handicap. That cannot be an inconvenience. And it's interesting that those are the words that are used. And also, again, in practice, I don't know that I've noticed much difference outside of there being less officers on the street, which for some of us, it's not a problem. And what it sounds like for the city of New Orleans is not a problem because the last reports that we were given about crime was down. So if crime is down and there's a crisis, that there are less police on the streets, doesn't seem like that's a crisis at all, right? So it's just very, I love TD. TD, if you're watching this, I love you, but it's not a crisis. It's the less officers on the street is not a crisis, especially if crime is down. So you're kind of making the case to keep the consent decree and not get rid of it.
You're trying to make it make sense.
Make it make sense.
Yes.
Like the math ain't mathing.
Right. Absolutely. So General Clark from the U.S. Department of Justice stated that along with other cities, New Orleans has seen a decrease in police use of force. Have you experienced this for yourself?
Don't you just love how people interpret the data? Gotta love data. I will say that what I've noticed is less reports of police brutality. The use of force, I've seen less reports, less official reports. But who are we talking to? Where are we getting this data? I think that there being less officers on the streets, naturally there's going to be a decrease in the use of force. The issue here is that there still remains that there's excessive use of force. There shouldn't be any at all. So to decrease, small win, sure. The issue is that it still remains, right? And if we're talking about it's an inconvenience for officers to fill out paperwork, are they all getting reported? And so my concern is the fact that there's still excessive use of force within the police department.
My last question for you, LaToya. Attorney General Garland from the U.S. Department of Justice lifted restrictions on consent decrees in 2021. What impact did that decision have on New Orleans and its consent decree?
I don't know that we saw much of an impact because I don't know that the restrictions themselves impacted how things operated in New Orleans, which says a lot because if the restrictions didn't handicap, we're going to use, right? If we're using handicap, didn't handicap the way things were happening in the city of New Orleans, that makes me question if anything was happening at all, if we were following the consent decree at all. And so I would say lifting the restrictions, much appreciated, but it also highlighted that things weren't exactly happening the way they should with the consent decree.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification, because I know that some of us here in Louisville are concerned about what will happen with the new presidential administration, where you have someone who is clearly anti-consent decrees and what impact that will have. So thank you for that. That's important for us to know. Well, I really appreciate your time with us today, LaToya. I want to ask you, though, do you have any brief closing comments that you would like to share with Louisvillians about our consent decree?
I think that Louisville has some strong organizers in that city, some really strong organizers. And it does not matter your bucket of work, right? The housing, food insecurities, labor or whatnot. Louisville has some strong organizers that work across buckets. And if the organizers in Louisville come together the way that they have previously, the way that we've seen in past years, I think that the way that you strategize around this consent decree would be imperative to how we move forward. There is so much potential for things to go right with this consent decree, with the organizers in Louisville. When I'm talking about building a strategy with community members, educating community members about what the consent decree actually does and what it actually says, I'm talking about developing realistic, actionable steps that people can participate in. Louisville has all of that already. And so I'm excited to see the organizing that's about to happen in Louisville around this consent decree.
Yes, and that excitement is infectious because, listen, I'm ready for our community to galvanize around this and to galvanize around accountability. So thank you to everyone who has tuned into this interview. And again, thank you to LaToya Johnson of New Orleans, a city that is under a consent decree, for joining us as you prepare to close out 2024. As always, remember the words of Harriet Tubman: keep going. We need people of goodwill to own your power and use your voice as we welcome in 2025. Stay healthy, stay safe, and stay live.
To those in our community who demanded change, thank you for speaking up.
To our community, thank you for your partnership as we move forward.
where we're going to be talking about the consent decree that was recently signed between Louisville Metro Government, the Louisville Metro Police Department, and the U.S. Department of Justice.
At the end of the day, the people of Louisville deserve constitutional and effective policing and nothing less.
Si no haces nada más,
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 mantente vivo.